Dr. Clare Walker is a master gardener and naturalist who has worked for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources as a naturalist and an educational outreach specialist. She currently installs and maintains wildlife-friendly native plant gardens. Over to you, Clare.
Thank you. Yeah, and now I actually am working full-time at Irvine Nature Center, which is just outside of Baltimore in Owings Mills, where I still install and care for wildlife gardens, and particularly pollinator gardens. And we're running a year-long study of all the bees at Irvine, so it's quite an exciting project we're in the middle of. Okay, well, welcome today. I'm really excited to talk about this brand new topic with lots of up-to-date latest research about what's been going on. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint so we can get started. So like I say, welcome. What we're going to be talking about today is looking at how we can look after pollinators in our yards in both fall and winter. And I really see this as completing the cycle for these animals, because lots of us today have started to think about trying to help pollinators and other wildlife in our gardens, and maybe are planting to help them and not realizing some of the things that we need to do to really support them through the whole year, so that we keep the numbers up in our yards. So what we're going to talk about today, well, we're going to start with fall, which seems a little ironic because we're really just coming to the end of the fall pollinator season. Most of the plants in my yard have died back, although I do have two that are still flowering. But the great thing about being a gardener is it's all about, the hopeful planning for next year. And this is actually a really great time to be thinking about how your garden is going to look next fall. And we're going to talk a lot about the best plants that we could be installing this year to help pollinators next fall. And then we're going to talk about what's coming up, the winter. And this is a really interesting topic because for a lot of people it's going to be completely new, the idea about where insects are hiding out in the winter. So we're going to look at the different life stages in winter, the eggs, larvae, pupal and adults that are all present in our yards, and taking that information about where they are hiding out to look at best habitat practices to support those pollinators. And then hopefully we'll finish by talking just about a surprising pollinator that is yet to visit our yards this year. So that'll be our final topic. So I'm sure for most of you, this is very much a revision of what you probably had to study all the way back in elementary school, the idea of what is pollination. And of course, it's the act of a flower being pollinated by an animal carrying the pollen from one flower to another, where it drops onto the female parts of that flower, thus fertilizing it. And for us, it's very important because, so much of our food requires this process. But for plants, it's absolutely essential. Without it, they can't have seeds, and so they can't have any offspring. And it's because of this requirement that they need to have seeds that the plants go through this elaborate process of producing showy flowers and lots of rewards of food for pollinators. So probably if I asked you, who are the pollinators in Maryland? I'm sure if we were live and in person, the first answer would probably be those bees, which are in Maryland the most important pollinator. So another top choice usually is butterflies. Butterflies are not as devoted a pollinator as bees, but they have a very important role, and we'll talk about that a bit later. And then, of course, we have one bird that pollinates in Maryland, ruby-throated hummingbird. And then normally by this point, the answers are getting a little harder of who are our pollinators, but we have a lot of moths that pollinate. And we also have a lot of flies, beetles, and wasps that are also important pollinators. But today we are really going to be focusing on this group over here, because if we support those pollinators, we're usually going to be helping out these lesser known pollinators as well. So, and of course, the reason we're probably all here today and why I was invited is we know about this problem of pollinator decline. And the numbers really are quite scary. A study done in 2019 suggested that there's been a 41% decrease in insect populations in the last just 10 years, with 53% of that being in butterflies and 46% are bees. So this is a really dramatic decline, and it threatens like our whole food system, from the insects that pollinate things like chocolate in the tropics, through to this very cute little squash bee who's busy here pollinating like a pumpkin or a zucchini. And this decline is happening right here in our region. So in Maryland, over the historic period, we know we had about 15 species of bumblebees. But as of now, 4 of those species have been extirpated from Maryland. You can no longer see them, and 6 of them are very rare. So we only have 5 of that 15 species still as common bumblebees here in Maryland. But so because of that, lots of us have been trying to put more and more plants in our yards that can help pollinators. And you can plant a lot of flowers, and you're going to bring in a lot of these pollinators. And it's just wonderful to be able to see butterflies flying around your yard. But one of the things that's happening is there's a really rapid development in our understanding of how we can truly support these creatures. And many of us, myself included, did things in the past that we realize now is not actually the best way to help these animals. And just like attracting them to your yard is not the same as supporting them, because if they come to your yard but then aren't able to reproduce and aren't able to survive the winter and reemerge the next year, then your yard actually just becomes a sink for these creatures. They come into your yard, but they end up dying in your yard and not reproducing, so that we don't support the next generation of butterflies and bees. So today we're going to really talk about how we can complete the cycle, make sure that next spring, there are as many pollinators in your yard as there were in the fall. And to do that, we're going to look at this hidden life of what insects are up to. So starting off, though, as I said, by looking at what our pollinators need in fall. And it's pretty simple. To attract pollinators into your yard in fall, all you have to offer is food. They're going to turn up. And for them, of course, food is flowers. They want nectar and pollen from those flowers. So there's 2 different big groups, though, that we can be looking at coming into our yard. And the first one is migrants. So these are animals that are going to be using that food to help fuel their migration, some of them very long migrations. And I bet if I was in person and I asked you to name the migrant I'm most talking about, that you'd all be realizing it's a monarch butterfly. So the generation of monarchs that emerge in the late summer, so August and early September, are different to the monarchs that come out of their chrysalises all the rest of the year, because this is a generation that is designed to migrate all the way to Mexico, like 2,000 or more miles. And the full generation of monarchs, they have bigger wings and they have bigger bodies. And those bodies are designed to store lots of fats to help fuel them on that migration. But we have another migrant also with a long way to go, and of course that's ruby-throated hummingbirds. And hummingbirds just live this high-intensity lifestyle of just constantly flying at high velocity, and they need vast amount of sugar energy to help support that. But they're also going to be in the fall taking that energy and starting to convert those carbohydrates into fat to lay it down so that they have the fat reserves to fly long distances. So probably most of us know about these two migrants, but we actually have a whole group of other butterflies who also migrate in the fall because they can't survive freezing weather. So everything from our painted ladies, American ladies, the red admiral, and even the common buckeyes will all fly south. So just like so many of us like to do in the wintertime, they're going to be heading mostly to places like Florida for some lovely winter sun and avoid all that cold, frosty weather. These butterflies aren't as well known for their migrations, merely because they don't have such a standardized way of doing it. This amazing relationship that the monarchs have where they all travel to the same place in Mexico. And if we actually look at that map of where these monarchs are going, they all obviously head down to central Mexico into the mountains where there's the Oyamel forests that they're going to hang out. But in my yard, and I'm sure many of you have planted milkweed as a way of supporting monarchs in our yard. And that milkweed is like fantastic because there's nothing better than, you know, having my kids watch caterpillars grow, go into their chrysalis and emerge. But living in the Maryland, Virginia area, it's really important to remember that the majority of monarchs that are going to be flying south on that migration are actually monarchs that didn't grow up here in Maryland. They're going to be all the monarchs from the southern Canada and all through the northeast, all flying down this coastal flyway on their way to Mexico. So there's millions of monarchs flying through our area that are only needing their nectar foods because they're beyond those fall migrating monarchs. You know, they actually are sexually inactive. They're not ready to reproduce. All they're thinking about is laying down that fat and flying. And there was a study done in the Virginia area where they actually compared monarchs flying along the coastal route to monarchs flying more further inland. And what they discovered was that those coastal monarchs appeared to be underweight. They just weren't finding enough nectar sources to truly be able to fatten up properly for that journey. And if you think about, you know, what conditions are like along that I-95 corridor that the monarchs are flying and along the coastal areas, how much of that is now just developed areas? It's all basically our suburban backyards and our parking lots and highways and stuff. And there just isn't the floral resources that they need to be able to properly fuel that migration. So the way to really help monarchs in our area is to plant that for fall nectar plants, and that's mostly going to be asters and goldenrods because those are the plants that are really high in nectar and are flowering during the peak migration period. But there are many other plants that you can plant, and I wanted to mention just a few of these because these are great ones for our area where so many of us are fighting really high deer populations. So if you have a dry site, you can plant this spectacular monarda. It's the spotted bee balm that just looks like something out of a Dr. Seuss novel or something for me. Really attractive, but it does need dry sites and it reseeds into that area to regrow each year, so you need some bare soil for it to thrive. If you have more medium soils or wetter soils, then both New York ironweed and wingstem are really interesting structural plants to have in your gardens. They're, you know, very tall and really that height is very appealing to monarchs for them to come to, because monarchs don't like to get into plants that are mixed in with a lot of other plants of the same height, because they know that's where those predators are going to be hanging out. So you never know when there's a lurking praying mantis that might want to grab you. So they actually will like focus on these plants that are out, you know, clear above the level of other plants so that they can, you know, carefully check out there's no predators lurking for them. But if you want more information on monarch nectar guides, we have the Xerxes has a really great guide just for our area, and we're going to be putting the links to those guides into the chat later. Okay, so our other fall migrant, like I say, you might want to support is hummingbirds. And they, as you probably know, really like red plants. And one of the last flowering of our red native plants is the cardinal. But you can also put in plants like blazing star, eastern and shaggy blazing stars, both late flowering plants that will support hummingbirds. And as you can see, monarchs like them too. But if you've ever tried to grow a cardinal flower, you might know that it's not the easiest plant in the world to grow. And that's because it's actually a biennial. So 1 year it just grows its leaves, and the second year it grows up tall and flowers, and then it dies. So you have to have it reseed in order to keep it in your yard year after year. And the nursery industry thought, yep, we can solve this problem. And what they did was they crossed Lobelia cardinalis, which is the red lobelia, with the blue lobelia, which is a perennial plant. And by doing this, they were able to create a perennial red lobelia plant cardinal. So there's quite a few different cultivars, but one of the most common is called fan scarlet. So if you imagine your life as a little hummingbird, you're flying madly around yards looking for things with lots of nectar, and you see this perfect plant and you're like, this is great, I'm going to go over and have a look. But unfortunately, the blue lobelia that they used in making this hybrid, it is designed to attract bumblebees. Bumblebees drink a tiny amount of nectar in comparison to a hummingbird. And so these hybrids only have a tiny amount of nectar in. So this is another case where you might attract a hummingbird, but you're not going to support it because it's going to take more energy as it tries to like find nectar on this plant than the amount of nectar that it's actually going to receive. So this is one of those times when you have to be a little bit careful and make sure that you are buying the straight native species. Okay, so just before I carry on into our noble fall bees, was there any questions? You doing good?
Hi, Claire. We do have a few questions. Someone wants to know, what is the rarest butterfly? I assume they mean the rarest butterfly maybe in our part of the world.
Oof. Yeah, so that's a very tough question, and I wouldn't be sure. I mean, for me, things like getting to see actually the Baltimore Checkerspot that we're going to come to later on is definitely becoming very rare in our area. I love the chance when I get to see vagrants, which is butterflies that fly up into our area from further south, like Gulf fritillaries and stuff like that. But I mean, there's a lot of butterflies in trouble, unfortunately, and most of them are ones that require rare plants and habitats, and that's like, requires very special support for them. So.
Thanks, Claire. And we've got one more butterfly question. Could you talk about raising black swallowtail larvae indoors? Do you recommend folks rear butterflies inside?
So I don't raise them inside because, like, if they emerge in the wintertime, which, if you keep them inside now, they've just gone into the chrysalis, most of the black swallowtail. So if you bring them inside, the temperatures can stimulate them to emerge from their chrysalis, but there isn't going to be any native nectar plants for them to eat. So you might be able to, support them yourself in a butterfly habitat. And certainly, that's what happens in butterfly houses, is that they grow tropical plants and they have fruits to like feed their butterflies through the year. And they have a big enough space that they can have multiple butterflies, so they actually are still able to breed and continue. But it's much better for me. Like, what I do is I put my black swallowtail chrysalis, even if I've raised them, I'm going to put them outside at this time of year maybe sometimes in a protected area like a screen porch, so that they get the right cues of temperature and day length, so that they don't emerge too early in the spring before the plants that they need are available for them to lay their eggs and to nectar on.
Thanks, Claire. And then we've got one last question for this section, which is, how do you feel about using Salvia splendens grandstand as something that will feed our pollinators?
Yeah, I do have some salvia in my yard. I don't know that particular cultivar, and I am going to cover some more information about cultivars. So I'll get back to that question when I have a slide about Mount Cuba. So I will get to that one then.
Perfect. Thanks, Claire.
Great. So if you remember, we talked about what do pollinators need in fall, and we looked at migrants, but there's also a whole load of fall bees out in our yards that also need a lot of support. And a lot of these bees, we don't really, they're so small that it's only when you see these large blown up photographs of them you can really appreciate how amazing they are to look at. We have blue bees, green bees, the masked bee at the bottom. And all of these bees are ones that are busy in the fall feeding the family. So these are all female bees, and bees only have a very short life for the most part. All these small bees are only going to live for about 6 weeks. And during that time, they're madly collecting as much food as they can, preparing nests, laying their eggs, and then all of these bees will die. They don't survive the winter. But there are 2 larger bees in our area, the bumblebees and carpenter bees, who actually in the fall are feeding up, because they're going to go into what is hibernation, except in insects we call that diapause. It's not quite the same thing as mammal hibernation. So these 2, like I say, are trying to do that fattening and bulking up, ready for that time of year. So what you might not realize is how many different types of bees that we have here in Maryland. So we have at least 430 to 450 bee species just in Maryland, and they fall into 47 commonly found genera of bees. So what I've popped up on here is if you went out into your yard and collected bees all through the year, these are the ones you would most commonly find. And often it kind of really surprises people that the bees that they know, so here's Bombus, the bumblebee over here, is going to be only a small percentage of all the bees that are in your yard. Honeybees, the apis bees, this little tiny sliver over here, and like the carpenter bee that almost every one of us knows because they make themselves so evident in our yards, actually such a small number in sort of total number of bees in your yard that they just fall into the other category. They don't get that open little segment of the pie. But all the bees that I have pictures of here are actually bee species that are very common in this fall period. So we can see that like some of the most common bees in your yard are ones that are focused on feeding in the fall, with a quarter of all those bees being in this one group called Lasioglossum, which are the little black bees. A very inventive name for them. And these bees are so tiny, they're about the size of a large grain of rice. And that's the reason that there can be so many of them in our yard and we don't even know that they're there. But I took a little video, and so hopefully we're going to see this video. So hopefully you can see all those little tiny bees just zooming around absolutely everywhere in the garden. So, like I said, there are those tiny bees, and they're all busily collecting flowers pollen from these flowers to feed their families. And one of the things that's kind of amazing about bees, once you realize that so many of them are so tiny, is each bee only needs to visit about 5 different flowers to collect enough food to feed one baby bee. So if you were trying to protect, for instance, bison in your yard, you need an area the size of Yellowstone to truly support a species like that. But bees are amazing because your backyard can be a Yellowstone for bees. You can support, up to 100 different species in a yard that's planted with lots of diverse plants, because each bee needs such a small amount of flowers to support their family. So it's really kind of inspiring to see how, if you plant a patch of a goldenrod like this, how many bees you can support. But if you want to know, but I really want to support bees in my yard, and you're like, how do I know which flowers to plant? Well, luckily, Penn State has done the work for us, and they did a study of the plants that were most popular with different pollinators by counting the number of visitors to each of these different flowers. And again, these resources I'm going to share with you, so you don't have to try and write down madly all of these details. But what I'm going to show you here is how, of this top 20 lists that they produced, 2 of the top 5 are actually different types of goldenrod. So these are supporting these huge numbers of bees, as you just saw. Another 3 of the top 20 are actually aster families. So Symphotrichium is the new science word for the asters. They changed the genus name. And another 5 of that top 20 are actually plants that are full blooming. So there's a whole load of great plants that you can put in your yard. They're going to support our pollinators in fall. And here I've got boneset, which has these very small white flowers that are very attractive. And then one of the last flowering plants in your yard can often be sneezeweed, which is, will be flowering almost until the frosts come. But, oh, sorry. Well, what I just wanted to notice is right at the bottom of this slide, we have the New England aster. So that might just have come in 20th place. But for me, this is a very special plant I really like to have in my yard because it's one of the favorite forms of forage for bumblebees in the fall. So bumblebee species have a complicated lifestyle. They're one of our few native bees that do live in a hive. So the hive starts back in the early spring and it grows through the whole summer. And then if they continue to grow into fall and there's lots of fall food around, that's when the queen will lay the eggs that will become next year's queens and the male bees, the drones. So the new queen bees emerge and they mate, and then the important part that's missed out on this little slide, so I added it in, is they have to go forage because they want to fatten up for the winter to have their food supplies to keep them through the winter. And then they're going to find a place to hibernate or diapause, so through the winter before they wake up next spring. So if you have a New England asters, you're usually going to find a lot of these queen bumblebees there. And we also have some bees that are called specialist bees. And these bees are bees that are kind of the pickiest moms of the bee families. So these bees will only feed their babies pollen, from one particular group of flowers. And they are feeding mostly pollen because pollen is high in protein. It's about 60% protein, and you can't raise a baby bee on just the sugar that is nectar. So they collect these flowers, this pollen, just from these particular flowers. And this particular bee here is called the banded hairy mining bee. It's a very cute little bee, and she, because of course all the mums doing the work, she will only collect pollen from goldenrods, and then she will make a nest. She's a mining bee, so she actually digs her hole into the ground and makes a little chamber, makes a big pile of pollen, lays the egg on that, and then seals that nest up, and the baby bee will stay underground in that nest all the way through until the following fall, when they will emerge. So the moms will never meet their offspring with these solitary bees. So the most common flowers for these solitary bees to want to collect pollen from, when they're specialists, is actually the goldenrods. So there are 39 species of bee in Maryland that only collect from goldenrods, and there's another 32 species that collect from the aster family. So those two groups of plants together are the most important ones to support bees in your yard. Like over 70 different species could be attracted just by having goldenrods and asters in your yard. Now the moms, they're picky for their offspring, but it does have to be said they will go to other flowers to gather nectar. So it's kind of like the mom who will only feed their child high quality organic food from Whole Foods, but will go to like any coffee store to pick up a coffee and get their morning buzz sort of thing. So that's what these bees are like as well. So by now you probably noticed I have mentioned the word goldenrod maybe a dozen times as the plants that really will help support our fall pollinators. But usually by this time someone was saying but doesn't goldenrod give you allergies? And aren't goldenrods really weedy and aggressive to take over your yard? So, well, yes and no. So no for the fact that these plants cause allergies. Then pollen on a goldenrod plant, as it is with any flower that's showy, is designed to be sticky and heavy and stick to a bee and stay stuck to that bee as it flies off to visit another flower, where then they hope that the pollen will be rubbed onto the stigma of that flower, the female parts. If the pollen drops off as the bee is just flying around, then that pollen is wasted. It just isn't going to get to the flower as it wants. All our allergies are actually created by windblown pollen, and that comes from flowers that we don't really notice because they're just green, insignificant flowers. And it's things like oak trees and conifers, and in the fall, a plant called ragwort, which happens to flower at the same time as goldenrod, and so gave goldenrod this bad reputation for causing allergies. But as I always tell everyone, you can only get an allergy from a goldenrod if you get your finger, rub it on the flower, and then take that pollen and rub it in your eye, because that's the only way for the pollen to move from the flower into your eyes and noses. Now, my other thing, as I said, was that people say they're weedy and aggressive, and this can definitely be true about goldenrods. So there are certain types of goldenrods that I'd never tell people to plant in a regular yard. If you were lucky enough and privileged enough to own a large meadow space that you're willing to turn into a beautiful wildflower meadow, then there are species of goldenrod like Canada goldenrod that you can let loose in a very large space. But those kinds of goldenrod should not be planted in a regular yard unless you want your whole yard to become goldenrod. But these are 3 very well behaved goldenrods. So there is literally a goldenrod for any yard. You just have to make sure you pick the right one. And of course, one of the wonderful things in our area with our heavy deer pressure is that the goldenrods are very deer resistant. Sometimes the deer will browse the tops of them in early spring, but it doesn't affect their flowering. They're still going to grow and flower. I have all of these plants in my yard, and I have herds of deer that run through my yard. So probably my top choice for how attractive a plant it is to have in your yard is the wrinkle leaf rugosa. And this particular cultivar called Fireworks has these shooting streams of arcs of yellow flowers that just makes it a dazzling display in your yard. A taller species, the showy goldenrod, stays clumped, it doesn't spread, and makes just a lovely single flower growth with this big plume of flowers on the top. And so this one is particularly attractive to bringing in monarchs. And then if you have drier soils, stony, rocky soils, and you want a shorter goldenrod, then a grey goldenrod is a great choice. It stays usually only about 2 feet tall, but still has these lovely plumes of golden flowers. And I have some resources that I'm going to put in the chat later that I will link you to more goldenrod choices for your yard conditions. But if you do have shady conditions, there's still amazing goldenrods to grow in your yard. And I actually think they look stunning in that dappled light, having these really bright yellow flowers pop in the late fall, when so much else in woodlands starts to die back. So both the blue stem goldenrod and the zigzag goldenrod, are deer resistant and grow really well in shade. Again, lots of asters are great in sunshine. So the New England aster that I mentioned before, this is a plant that will be nibbled in the early spring by deer, but once they outgrow, after their initial growth, the deer leave them alone. So I either plant them where deer can't get at them, or I do sometimes use a bit of deer spray on this plant in the early spring. But in later spring, the deer can actually be really useful because they will nibble this plant back in like late May, early June. And if they don't do that, I actually always prune this plant because it gets too tall otherwise. And later in the year, the leaves do tend to die back, so I like it at the back of my planting bed, so the plants in front will hide the way the lower leaves die back on this plant. Another great option is Calico Aster, which is one of the last flowering, and so it will be covered with green sweat bees in the fall, and is very deer resistant, grows very compact with masses of flowers. And the aromatic aster as well, has larger flowers, very compact and super showy. And again, of course, there are also asters for the shade, from the whitewood aster to the bluewood aster, are both like spectacular plants to have in the shade. Now, just again, a word of caution about using nativars, which is versions of these plants that have been bred by nurseries, usually to look good for people, but without any regard as to whether they still support the pollinators that they evolved to support. And in a study that was done by Dr. Annie White, she monitored the number of visitors to the straight New England aster compared to a nativar, this cultivated version of the plant, the Elmer Potschke, I think that's pronounced. And she found that every 5 minutes, there'd be 48 visitors on average to the New England aster, but only 5 on this cultivar. So yeah, definitely, if you're looking to support pollinators, a straight species are normally the way to go. But luckily, and this comes back to that question about salvia and the different cultivars, is we have the Mount Cuba Garden Center in Delaware, and they've been running lots of trials to look at how well different cultivars support pollinators. And you can go on to their pages and look at it, and they've tried out many different species of plant, and they will tell you, which plants worked best in their trials. So for instance, for aster, for them it was the bluebird, the smooth aster was the best cultivar that they tried out for supporting pollinators. So all that kind of really detailed information is definitely available from Mount Cuba. Right, but I don't want to miss our chance to talk about supporting pollinators in winter. So even though this is a time of year we might not see them, it's vital that we help support them. And in the winter, it's all about habitat, where these animals can be hiding away, trying to avoid the worst of the weather. And some of them are going to be hiding behind bark, especially peely, loose bark, so often on dead trees. They're going to be hiding out in the leaf litter, leaf litter fallen from trees, and leaf litter just in your flowering beds that have fallen off these flowers. Some of them are hanging out on the plant stems, and others are going to be in stumps and decaying logs on your ground. So first, I'm just going to have a quick look at the bees, even though they won't be the focus of my winter thing. Of course, remember, I talked about bumblebees hibernating. It's the queens. So she's looking for a place under leaves, under lots of fallen grasses, things like that, sometimes in under ledges and rocks in the ground to find a habitat to hang out. But most of our bees are what we call ground nesting bees, like the mining bee I talked about earlier. And what they actually do is dig holes down into the ground. So if you have the habitat for these bees, which is some bare soil, in the winter, they're like snug and secure, 10 inches or so down in the soil, and they are happy bunnies the whole winter long. But the bees that often do need our help is the 20% of bees that actually live in hollow cavities. So these are looking for those like rotten logs on the ground and digging into like soft decaying wood to find their home, or they're digging into plants that have hollow or soft pithy centers, and they will make their homes there. And there's actually this whole guide of how you can maintain your garden in the wintertime that will help these plants. And what they have to do is in the winter to leave your plants, dead plants standing, many of which are very attractive, like the coneflowers I had the picture of earlier. And then in the springtime, cutting back the stems and leaving them like 8 to 20 inches high. And eventually the new growth obviously will come up and cover those cut stems, but those cut stems is where the bees will then make their homes for their babies inside those cut stems. And so the next winter, like those stems will still be there hidden under the following year's growth of flowers. And the next spring, that's when those bees will emerge. Okay, so it's just like how you maintain those flowers will give these bees places for them to build their homes. But in actual fact, the animals that need more help in the winter, even though as a bee person, I have a hard time saying this, is the butterflies and moths. And because butterflies and moths can spend the winter in any form, they can be in eggs, caterpillar, the chrysalis or cocoon, or even as adults. But of all these different forms, this is like not much work has been done in the US, and the main resource for looking at this is actually what's been done in the UK. Not that I'm totally biased, of course, that you might be able to tell, that's my home country. But most caterpillars appear to spend the winter actually as pupa. Okay, so more than half of them are in the chrysalis or cocoon stage. But we do have some butterflies that spend their winters as adults. So most of these Nymphalid butterflies. So we've got the question mark, the comma, and the morning cloak here, which are all just spectacular butterflies. And these do overwinter as adults, and they're getting into those narrow cracks in loose bark, and sometimes like even woodsheds and stuff like that is where they're going to be spending their winter. So if you're able to leave snags like dead trees and fallen logs on your property, you're going to give the kind of habitat that these guys are looking for. And a whole load of butterflies actually do spend the winter as caterpillars. So this is the Baltimore Checkerspot, so the state insect of Maryland. Unfortunately, very rare in Maryland now because of things like climate change have really impacted them. But these Baltimore Checkerspots, they lay their eggs actually in the late summer when their host plant, the turtle heads, are nice and big and healthy looking. And they grow as caterpillars until they get to their 4th instar, which instar just means how many times they've taken their clothes off, which is their outer skin, and become a larger caterpillar. And when they get to the 4th instar, they actually just crawl down the stem of that turtle head, and they just make kind of a bit of a web at the bottom of that plant, and that's exactly where they hang out all winter long. So to support these butterflies, you mustn't clean out the materials at the bottoms of these plants, because that's where they're hiding out for the winter. Even though the checkerspot, a Baltimore checkerspot, is very rare, most of us are going to have the silvery checkerspot in our yards, and these butterflies do the exact same thing. So the caterpillars were in the late fall are going to crawl to the bottom of the plant, their host plants, which is actually mostly aster family plants. So they're eating those asters, then they crawl down and they're going to overwinter right at the base of those plants. So leaving leaves in your flower beds around your plants is really important to support them as they overwinter. Now, some of our butterfly that does this is the Great Spangled Fritillaries. They have these amazing looking caterpillars that eat violets, and so the second generation of the caterpillars will start to eat the violets in the fall, and then they just crawl down and hide out in the leaf litter underneath those violets. So that's where they're going to be in the winter until the violets regrow in the spring. And of course, most of us have seen woolly bears that are crawling around in the late fall. And these guys are actually out and about looking for a snug place to hide. So they're going to try and get into logs, under rocks and stones. So basically, they just need a little bit of mess, some place that's nice and hidden to hide. So leaving places for them to hide. If you have a really neat yard with no debris, there is nowhere for a woolly bear to go hang out for the winter. Now, some of our chrysalis, this is one of the ones we talked about earlier, do butterflies overwinter as chrysalis on plants. So both the black swallowtail we talked about earlier, and then this clouded sulfur, make these amazing looking chrysalis on the plants themselves. So if you cut back plant stems, you might by accident cut away these chrysalis. So cutting back plants isn't a bad thing if you then cut all those things that you've cut back, if you just put them in your yard in a place where any of the butterflies that are still attached to those plants as chrysalis still have a chance to emerge. It's when we put them all in the bags to go off for composting that we lose all of these overwintering butterflies. And this, of course, you might all recognize as the lunar moth. I slipped this one in. It's not technically a pollinator because it doesn't come to flowers, but I think most people would agree that this is the kind of insect diversity that we still really want to have in our yards, and we can't value an insect just because it's a pollinator or not a pollinator. This is still, a insect that deserves to stay in our world. And this moth, they overwinter by wrapping themselves up in leaves and then forming their cocoon inside that leaf. And so as the leaves age, they're just sitting in that leaf litter. And when I show this picture, it makes you realize if you're cleaning up leaf litter in your yard, there's absolutely no way that you would be able to tell if you're cleaning up and throwing away these lunar moth cocoons, which are just so well camouflaged to naturally survive in the leaf litter over winter. But in actual fact, remember I said that most butterflies and moths overwinter as these pupa, the cocoon or the chrysalis, and most of them are doing it right on the ground, just below the level of the soil. And the caterpillars come down, they dig slightly under the ground, and in that top inch of soil is where they form their chrysalis or cocoon. And sometimes when you're digging in your yard, you're going to find these, and they're very shallow. Unlike those bees that are up to 10 inches down, they're very shallow. And that's important because when they emerge from these chrysalis, they're going to be a butterfly or a moth with those soft, easily damaged wings. And so they can only crawl back up a short distance through the soil. And a whole load of our pollinating moths do this. So the sphinx and the hummingbird, clear wings and stuff, they're all overwintering in these cocoons just below the surface of the ground. Now that we've been doing some work on what are the impacts of the fact that in residential lawns, most of the leaves that fall from trees just get gathered up and like bagged up and sent off for composting. In fact, in the US, 8.5 million tons of leaves are removed from lawns. So Max Filetto at the Burkhardt Lab, University of Maryland, has actually been doing some studies on the impacts of removing all these leaves. And he's put up test plots in both forested areas and now residential lawns, where he cleans off leaves or leaves leaves without raking them, and then puts emergence traps on top of these areas. So it's basically a netted area on top. So the following spring, you can see how many butterflies and moths do emerge. So I'm going to just briefly show you his research, because I don't want to get into it too technically, but he looked at what happens when you add leaves. Many of us obviously blow leaves off of our lawns and put them into other areas. What happens if the leaves aren't moved at all? What happens if those leaves are like shredded, like put through a lawnmower or whatever, and then put back? And what happens when the leaves are removed completely? And what he found was both the mulching and the removal process massively reduced the amount of Lepidoptera, the butterflies and moths that survive the winter. So it was decreased by more than 60% the populations of these overwintering animals. So, and one of the reasons that this might be happening is if we look at the temperature in the soil. So remember, these cocoons are just below the surface of the soil. And in both where more leaves were added or in the control area where the leaves were left on the ground, those leaves act like a lovely blanket, and they help keep the soil nice and steady in their temperature, so that the extremes of temperatures, aren't suffered by in the actual soil. But if we look at this area where the leaves are removed, you can see how much more the temperature fluctuates from day to day. And then if we look at the 0 line, so 0 Celsius, when temperatures fall below 0, so much more frequently the temperatures fall below zero once you remove that layer of leaves acting as a blanket. So the most important part of this talk is really the way if we want to protect our pollinators, we have to think about how they're spending the winter, and we need to leave the leaves. And there's something that's like kind of also living in those leaves that's also a pretty amazing thing that you can help support by leaving your leaves. So does anyone recognize like who this little larva that crawls around in your leaves is going to become? Does anyone have any guesses? Let's see, I can't see the chat, so I'm relying if anyone's going to make a guess.
We don't have any guesses yet.
So this is a creature that the first time I saw one of these as a larva, I was very excited. But the first time I saw one as an adult, when I moved to America 20 years ago, it just blew my mind, because we don't have these in Europe, but it's actually this guy. So this is the larva of fireflies, and the larvae live in your leaf litter, and they're voracious predators of slugs and snails. So these are like our gardener friends, these guys. So not only are they putting on those spectacular displays of light in the summer, they're also helping hunt down predators in your yard. But to do that, you have to leave the leaves, because that's where they live. So many of us have lawns that, yards that look a bit like this. Until very recently, I did too. But what we've come to realize is having a yard that looks like this is an ecological trap for our caterpillars. Because these caterpillars, like their moms, come and lay eggs on these trees that are native oak trees or maple trees. The caterpillars grow in the leaves, and then to spend the winter, they're going to drop down out of the tree or crawl down. And then in the area at the base of the tree, they need to find a place to safely overwinter if you're a silk moth like this one. And either they can't get into the ground because we've got so compacted soil underneath the trees, where if you're mowing right up to the base of the tree, or while they're wandering around, they get eaten by birds, or if they do get under the soil and try and overwinter there, because there's no blanket of leaves to keep them warm, that fluctuating temperature actually means that they don't survive the winter. So instead of that, what we should be really thinking about is underneath our trees, using plants as habitat to really give protected areas for those trees, butterflies and moths to overwinter. So it also really helps to keep down the amount of maintenance you need to do in your yard. If you have what's called a green mulch layer, a layer planted as a base layer underneath your trees and flowers, if you have them in there too. And particularly if you put evergreen plants or semi-evergreen plants growing underneath your trees, this gives a really lovely sheltered place for your caterpillars to hang out for the winter. So things like foamflower, golden ragwort, coral bells are all really great native plants that you can use underneath those trees. And these ones themselves, in the springtime, they're going to flower and support a lot of bees as well. Both foamflower and the golden ragwort and coral bells all have specialist bees that will come to those plants and no others. So you're going to increase the number of species of bees in your yard. Right now is a great time to start gardening. Like I said, this is the time when we start to dream big. Next year, I'm going to have a great garden. So this is me. I've reduced my lawn, cut the grass as short as I possibly can, and then I filled it with mulch just to kill the grass over the winter time, so that by next year, this was all ready for me to plant into and to make a new pollinator garden. And then, as I said, I was just going to finish with the fact that there is still, amazingly enough, a plant out there that is yet to flower, and that is the witch hazel. So in another few weeks to a month, suddenly the witch hazels will flower. And it's like this amazing thing. Why does a plant choose to flower in the wintertime when this is a time when there are so few insects about? But the thought today about why the hazel is flowering in the wintertime is that witch hazels are kind of like that gas station that you go to visit at 1 o'clock in the morning to buy milk because it's the only place that's open and selling milk. And just like that, in the wintertime, the hazel is the only flower out there to go and collect nectar from. And of the pollinators that they collect in late November and early December, 70% of them, when they're collected, actually have pollen from witch hazels on their bodies. So it really does work as their strategy of being like the last gas station available to get your food at. And there is a particular type of moth that will visit these flowers in the wintertime. And these are moths that are able to fly in the winter when normal insects can't because it's too cold, because they're actually able to shiver. So they get their bodies and they shiver as hard as they can, and they raise their body temperature, as well as having extremely furry bodies to keep that heat in. And that allows them to fly in the wintertime and visit as pollinators to hazel. And also they'll go to like sap and things like that to find more food. So yeah, even in the wintertime, you might be able to attract some pollinators to your yard if you have witch hazel. Okay, so just over time, I'm sorry about that. But yep, that's hopefully given you lots of ideas of ways that you can, going forward, support more pollinators in your yards. So I'd be happy to stop sharing and see if we have any questions.
So we've got some questions here. One of my favorites is someone lives in the wood with a lot of planted areas, and they're worried that if they leave all of the leaf litter, that it's just going to be too much. And so is it better for them to clear the earlier leaf fall or the later leaf fall? Or should they blow them all into giant leaf piles?
That is a really good question, and I feel like that should be a research topic, because as far as I know, no one has ever looked as to whether there's more in the early or more in the late things. As much as possible, if you're just able to rake or blow leaves into areas. I mean, like, obviously most people, you can't leave your leaves on your actual lawn because it's going to kill the grass. But what I have is large enough areas that are beds where I can blow my leaves underneath trees and stuff so that they can naturally stay and start to decompose. And one of the things I will say is that the early leaves tend to be things like maples, which break down very quickly. So if you're worried about having your leaf litter break down and turn into, like, the lovely golden dark black, gold that it becomes, then your maples and early leaves are going to do that much quicker. The oak leaves that come down later, sometimes not even till spring, really late winter, early spring, some of those oak leaves are held to. They are much like stiffer, firmer, and they take 2 years to break down. So they work great as kind of a mulch to keep weeds from growing. So if you want to deter weeds the next year, then your oak leaves are a really great choice as the ones to leave. So maybe it depends what you want your leaves to be doing in your lawn, is that what to think about.
Thanks, Claire. And we have another question here, which is, do you know any groups that sort of lobby for HOAs in cities to make it easier to leave your leaves?
We have successfully, there was last year in Maryland, at least, I think it might have been one of the first in the country, there was a law that allows homeowners to have the right to have an environmentally friendly yard, so that a HOA is not allowed to tell you anymore to take out pollinator gardens and things. But as long as it looks like you are obviously maintaining it, obviously there's no excuse to just have this horrible, overgrown, full of invasives kind of yard. And that's not what the legislation is designed to support. And I think, there are definitely groups that are working on allowing, friendly yard use, and I suspect there's stuff going on in both DC and Virginia, but I'm just not as aware about those resources. But usually the master gardener groups are pretty heavily involved in trying to help people have more environmentally friendly gardening.
That's great to hear. Our next question is, how do weed killers and products like that affect overwintering wildlife?
So to be honest, you really shouldn't be using weed killers in the winter, because almost all weed killers aren't effective if the plants aren't growing. So if you look at, and you should always read the directions before using any form of herbicide or pesticide. And the instructions are definitely going to tell you that it's only going to work above a certain air temperature and during the active growing period of those plants. There's only a few that you can use in the wintertime, and most of those are things like stump applications, which will have no impact on pollinators whatsoever. So I always try and say, if you're going to use herbicides or pesticides, you always use the least you can. You use it in the most safe way you can. So for instance, if there's an invasive tree that I need to remove, then I'm going to cut the tree and paint the stump, because then all of that pesticide is in the actual tree that we're trying to remove. And just like using it widely is not good practice for anybody for helping any of our pollinators. And mostly, I know in Maryland, there's a law that you can't apply these products onto your lawn after a certain date when your grass isn't growing anymore. So you're breaking the law if you apply those products in the wintertime.
Wow, that is good to know. We've got another question on timing. So someone wants to know if you are leaving your leaf litter and perennial stems, at what point in the spring is it safe to clear them if we're trying to create habitat for pollinators?
Okay, so the advice that most people go with is when you start, the first time you need to cut your grass is usually when it becomes safer to do it. Now, if you want to cut stuff back before then, the secret that I will often do, because sometimes if I have a big snow event, everything kind of gets knocked down and it just looks very messy, is I will cut my plant material and I stack it, and I have an area in the rear of my yard under where I have my trees, and I will just put those materials back there until we've hit about 60 degrees Fahrenheit for a couple of days, because that's when most insects start to emerge after 55. That's when they can fly. Before then, it's just too cold. So once I've had a few days over 60, then I'm like, yeah, they should have all have had their chance to emerge by now, and I can start cleaning up.
Great. And along those lines, what is the best time of year? If you have a meadow, what's the best time of year to mow that meadow?
So it's pretty much the same time. So late spring is the best time to mow meadows. So if you time it right, you can time it when invasives have started to grow. So you can knock those back, because most of our invasives, like coming from other countries, are more adapted to growing really fast in the spring. And our native plants usually get a later start. You don't even see milkweeds popping their heads up until late in May. So you can time your cuttings to cut back invasives, but not impact native plants, and really help them. And if a few lucky people, if you have that chance to be able to do a burn, that's even better. And you can do that at any time of year through the winter, usually late fall, to do burns. But what you tend to do is just burn an area of your meadow each year. So because you will kill animals in that area, but they will repopulate from the areas that you don't burn. So you can do the same strategy with mowing, mow one area and not the other, so that animals can repopulate from the area that didn't get mowed.
Thank you. And we've got another question here about does leaving full-size leaves, does that ever prevent seeds from germinating that had, plants that have self-seeded in the fall?
So yes, it can. And for things like that cardinal plant, if there's too dense of a leaf cover, that will prevent some of those ones that reseed. So what I tend to find is it's those oak leaves that can have that impact. So when I'm blowing oak leaves, I do tend to try and put them into areas where I already have established plants that I know will just push straight up for the leaves, and they are not going to care. I don't put oak leaves into beds where I might have my smaller, more fragile plants that are just going to go, when this oak leave's too heavy, I can't lift it, and things. So yeah, the oak leaves are definitely the ones that plants have a hard time with. So use them to control weeds in places you want weed control.
Well, Claire, I just want to say thank you so much. This was an incredible presentation, and thank you to everyone who attended today.